Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, and a very warm welcome to the first part of this webinar series on open source in energy access, hosted by the EnAccess Foundation. My name is Gabrielle Pammesberger. I work with the Alliance for Rural Electrification as its Africa lead. As the largest international business association for the decentralized renewable energy sector, ARE is promoting the development of a sustainable off-grid energy industry. We are doing this by supporting the private sector and key institutional stakeholders, and through a wide range of market building activities aimed at accelerating energy access in emerging markets. Hence, it's a great pleasure for ARE to support this webinar series on open source in energy access, hosted by our valued member, the EnAccess Foundation, which will discuss how open sourcing innovation in the energy access space can benefit the different market players, increase efficiency, and hence accelerate the development of the sector. This series of webinars will explore and discuss the ongoing work in open source in energy access, and will provide first-hand experience from innovators and from adopters of such innovations. So in today's first webinar, we will learn about the basic principles of open sourcing and how it works. And we will hear directly from innovators about their specific experience with open sourcing. So let me briefly introduce today's speakers before I hand over to Fabio, who will be the moderator of today's session. In fact, I would suggest to do just a brief tour de table and ask each of the speakers to very briefly introduce her or himself, just 1 or 2 sentences about yourself, your organization, and your position. So I will start with Mr. Fabio De Pascale, co-founder of the EnAccess Foundation, who will be today's moderator. Fabio, please.
So hi to all. It's a pleasure being here and pleasure moderating this webinar. My name is Fabio, and I am a co-founder and the chairman of the board at the EnAccess Foundation. I am also the CEO of a energy access company called NextGrid. And in the past, I've been running another company called Evergy, doing mini grids in Tanzania. So we're very excited to be part of this meeting. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Fabio. And now we'd like to welcome today's panelists. So I will start with Ms. Annette Mumbi. So Annette is an associate with the CrossBoundary Energy Access, an investment firm specialized in project finance for clean energy mini grids. So Annette, please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Gabrielle. So my name is Annette Mumbi. I'm an associate at CrossBoundary Energy Access. And CBEA itself is an investment platform that is dedicated towards financing mini-grid projects across Africa. So we usually invest long-term equity and debt through a project finance structure to build and own mini-grid projects. We launched in 2019, and we're currently fundraising for our scale-up platform, which is $150 million to bring power to 1 million people across Africa. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So I hand over to Mr. Bryan Silverthorn, CTO at Angaza, a leading technology provider who spearheaded the development of digital payment platforms in the energy access industry. Bryan.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm CTO here at Angaza, and we build software for last mile distribution businesses, whether they're selling solar home systems or cook stoves or smartphones, and often selling via pay-as-you-go. So we give them tools to handle everything from point of sale to follow up to payment processing, and also IoT interaction for metering and appliance servicing, which is an area where we've released and supported multiple open source projects.
Okay, thank you, Bryan. And finally, Mr. Dimitris Mentis, a Senior Energy Geographer and project lead for the development of the open source platform Energy Access Explorer at the World Resources Institute.
Good morning and good afternoon, everyone, wherever you are. And thanks to EnAccess Foundation and the Alliance for Electrification, for organizing this exciting webinar. My name is Dimitris Mentis. As you mentioned, Gabriel, I'm a Senior Energy Geographer with the World Resources Institute, lead the development of the Energy Access Explorer. I've been working in the intersection of geographic information systems and energy systems analysis, energy planning for more than 12 years, and I have had the opportunity to develop about three open source geospatial solutions in the energy access space. Very excited to be with all of you here. Thanks.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much for these brief introductions. So now I will hand over to Fabio, who will moderate today's session, and wishing you all an excellent and very exciting discussion. Thank you, and Fabio, over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Gabriel. I thought before starting, really, I'd maybe just explain what we think will be a good, let's say, a good outcome of this webinar. As EnAccess, we're very committed and very passionate about open source, and essentially what we would like to see is much more open source and much more sharing in the energy access sector. A fundamental reason for that is we think that this is a very challenging sector to be in. It's also a resource constrained sector, especially considering the amount of capital needed to actually achieve universal energy access. And for this reason, we find that open source could be a very good accelerator, something that could help us reach universal energy access faster. This is the very reason for which EnAccess was born in the first place. And today we are sort of trying to help on that front by increasing the awareness around open source. So the webinar today is really focused on the question, what is open source and how can energy access companies contribute to it, benefit from it, adopt it. So it wants to be a relatively high level view on the open source landscape for energy access. I'm incredibly proud actually to have our panelists today, and the reason is that they do represent three different takes on open source in the sector. We have Annette coming from CBEA, and clearly they have a take around open source, which is around the models and the legal frameworks and so on. So something that not so many people actually associate with when they talk about open source. Typically the association is closer to technology, and that's where Bryan comes in. It's probably closer to the classical association around open source, and I hope that Bryan will be able to share his experiences in that. But finally, we also had Dimitris, and that comes in with yet another take, which is let's say the connection between open sourcing in tools and methods versus the data component of open source. So these are again just three different takes on the same macro concept, and hopefully we are going to be able to hear from the participants today about that. Just some house rules. Feel free to ask questions in the chat as we go. We will likely go with the conversation without the main interruptions, but we plan to have a 10-15 minutes Q&A session at the end. So please make sure to post your questions if you have any as we go. Also, we will actually record this webinar. So if you have to go for another call at some point, don't worry, you will be able to watch it later. And I'm sure that that's exactly what you want to do tonight. Just watch this again and again and again for the next foreseeable future. Let's get moving now. I'll actually see if I can show you something else on these slides. Yes, there we go. So I just wanted to give a very high level intro to open source, and then we're gonna go into the core of the conversation. Why open source? I think that's a legitimate question. And the first one is SDG 7 requires innovative models and approaches. So what does that mean? It means that if you're doing something really, really hard, you might have to innovate. And we actually see that in this sector. There is a lot of innovation happening, and open source can actually help with that. The other thing that we see is that the energy access companies are using very scarce funds. Yes, there is money in the sector, but arguably is not even remotely enough to achieve the targets we have. And finally, this means that the companies in the sector and broadly organizations are spending a lot of resources innovating instead of using those resources to actually reach end users. And while we do all welcome and see the need for innovation, we also don't think it's the smart way to use funds. So that's where we come in and say, hey, why don't we actually share the innovation so others don't need to reinvent the wheel? So what are the reasons for companies to use open source or to participate to this? One, reach a wider market. This takes different I would say aspects, these different looks. One is very obvious. Open source can be a very good marketing tool. There are companies that embrace open source because this allows them to reach a wider audience, and people will notice these companies because they're doing open source releases. Now, this is perfectly viable. We also see that there is a second part to it. By open sourcing all or part of your innovation, people start looking at your other services. And so what happens is you start effectively connecting to people, and maybe they can use something for free because you open source it, but they then want to use some other tools, which is either not open source or they want to have support services. So this is typically a way to increase your market size. Another one is to improve an existing work. This is the image you see is a very classical example in the open source narrative, which is the grandma. Grandma is making cookies, and she has this super secret recipe that nobody knows about. But you know, at some point, the kids would like to make the cookies too, and they need that recipe. Otherwise, they will not be able to. At some point, grandma will not be there. And if she's gone and the secret recipe is gone too, we have a problem. We're going to reinvent that recipe. So isn't it better if grandma was to share the recipe and the kids were able to actually take it and do it again, but also, and this is an essential part of open source, could tweak it, because actually they never liked the raisins in those cookies. They really wanted chocolate chips. And at some point they can, if they have the recipe and they can adapt it to their needs. The other one is, of course, to leverage a community. Open source comes with a community, and effectively this community is the set of people that use the open source innovation, the set of people that help improve it, and that's very helpful. It's something that can really make a difference. It can bring much higher quality of work also around the open source materials. And finally, leverage data. There is a number of models where companies share open source tools, but not the data. The data sometimes cannot be shared. Sometimes the data has confidential elements. Sometimes the data is really a lot of work and is the core business for the company. So the company might be actually very happy to share the tools they use, but may actually ask a fee for the data components or the data set that goes with the tool. One can still use the tool with other data sets that can develop independently, or that data set is maybe not relevant because it's another geography. In that case, you know, one would not want to use the data set, but still would want to use the tool. So this just wanted to be a very high-level overview on potential reasons for using or embracing open source approaches and philosophies in energy access. But as I said before, I think it would be a bit more interesting to hear from the real doers and the ones that actually have shared information in the past. So let me now go into the actual conversation, and let me just start. I'm going to go alphabetically, but let me start with Annette, and maybe ask very openly, what's your experience with open source? How did you and CrossBoundary Energy Access interact with open source, and what has been, you know, the general go-to approach that you guys used? Please, Annette.
All right, thank you, Fabio, for the opportunity to speak and for the introduction. So I'll I'll go into what CBEA open sourced and the reasons why we did it. So just as a background, so CBEA open sourced the project financing approach that we have used to structure bankable projects for mini-grids and to invest in mini-grids across Africa. And so as a background, prior to launching in 2019, as CBEA, we had noted that, or research rather showed that there were about 600 million people in Africa who did not have access to electricity, and that mini-grids were going to be the least cost option to provide power to at least 260 million of them by 2030. But what we realized, however, was that mini-grids were not attracting the capital that they needed to scale. So CBEA, together with our partners, so that those are investors and developers. So we developed this project financing approach that invests in mini-grids and as infrastructure. And through that approach, in 2019, we were able to raise and invest infrastructure capital in mini-grids through our pilot fund CBEA1. And like I'd earlier mentioned, we're actually fundraising for $150 million more to invest in mini-grids across Africa that bring power to 1 million people. So in terms of what we actually did, so we'd spent about 3 years adapting traditional project finance for, distributed assets and mini-grids in this case. So when we came up with this approach and implemented it in practice and invested it in actual assets, at the end of 2020, that's in December 2020, we went out to the market and shared one of the components of our open source was this white paper, which you can access on CrossBoundary's website. So the white paper has, I'd say, 3 key components. So one, it has detailed information on how to structure a bankable mini-grid project in Africa, including how to use project finance and how to structure and invest infrastructure capital for mini-grids. Also, some of the things that we shared in that white paper, which was part of our open source project, was the lessons that we had learned from implementing that approach in practice, as well as certain recommendations for the sector that we believed that if implemented by donors, developers, etc., would help unlock more capital and bring more capital into the sector. So in terms of why, we've been asked a lot of times, like, why did you do this? And the main reason, to be honest, was we realized that, the sector has this shared goal to bring power to 600 million people. And we'd spent 3 years working on this approach and trying to figure out why has capital not been flowing to mini-grids, and we found one way that works. And after implementing it, the thing that we wanted to do was share it out there, share as much detail as possible, so that other stakeholders can replicate the, transactions like ours, but not have to take the 3 years, So we want people we shared our approach so that people can do it faster and at less cost, so that we can all achieve the shared goal. And I think the numbers, especially when you think about the numbers in the mini-grid space, the International Energy Agency forecasts that the sector needs about 187 billion of public and private sector capital, but at the time that they did the report, only 350 million had been raised by mini-grid developers. So the need is great, and as CBEA, we're raising 150 million, but it's just it's just a drop in the ocean, given that we want to bring power to 1 million people, but there's only 600 million people. There's 600 million people without power. So we acknowledge that we can't do it alone. So all of these things that we have learned, we shared them with the sector, so that other people can go on and do their own transactions, so that we can all work towards the shared goal. Yeah, thanks.
So let me now be very uncreative. Bryan, same question.
Yeah, thank you, Fabio. So Angaza, we work with hundreds of last mile distributors across a few dozen markets, and we also partner with dozens of manufacturing companies in the space. They develop products for off-grid markets, they deploy in rural areas, and many of them support what's called pay-as-you-go metering. So this is when a last mile distributor is selling a product on credit, and then the product itself enforces in some fashion the terms of the credit. And so Angaza, we work with the distributor, but we also need to partner with the manufacturer so that we can actually communicate with these devices and manage the entire sort of consumer life cycle, including those credit terms. And since the beginning, we've done a lot of technology development related to these devices, how pay-as-you-go systems work, how you should have sort of smart devices in the context of last mile distribution. And we've released a range of open source work over the years, but probably the largest open source projects we maintain all fall under what we call the EnAccess label, which covers several of those different enabling technologies for pay-as-you-go products. I'll mention a couple of them, and I'm sure we can get into more detail later in this webinar. But one is called EnAccess Key Code. It implements an interoperable pay-as-you-go token protocol. It represents what's already been deployed in millions of devices, and is really maybe the core enabling technology for a pay-as-you-go product. So this helps a manufacturer when they want to bring a pay-as-you-go product to market. And then second, we have a project called EnAccess Channel. It's an application layer for secure device-to-device communication. You can think a solar home system powering a television and able to communicate, say, power limits or the pay-as-you-go status to that appliance. And one interesting thing about EnAccess Channel is that it itself builds on open standards, such as what's called OCF, or Open Connectivity Foundation Standard. I think that's a great example of how open source is an ecosystem where you reuse and can build on the work of other people, and it sort of builds on its own strengths in that way. Anyway, you can find a lot more information at nexus.angaza.com. I'll mention a couple of reasons that we've open sourced a few different projects. The first reason is just we're making a contribution to the energy access industry specifically because we think it benefits our customers and partners and thus Angaza. I'd say that's a big reason we've done so much open source work in our Nexus projects. And I think Annette touched on this as well, but fragmentation and sort of diversion of effort in this industry, it benefits nobody. So we want energy access companies focused on building their businesses, not trying to reinvent pay-as-you-go protocols or struggling with how different products work in different ways. And on the Angaza side, energy that we are putting into different ways that pay-as-you-go systems specifically operate, that's energy not going into building new tools or more effective tools for our last mile distribution customers. And then the second reason is we are contributing back to what I'll call the broader open source community in some fashion. So like I'd say every modern technology company, Angaza leverages a lot of open source code ourselves and sees ourselves as part of that broader community in which technology companies are building on the efforts of one another. So we make an effort to contribute upstream. That's sometimes with improvements, it's sometimes with bug fixes, and it's sometimes with open source tools that benefit some particular project ecosystem that we rely on. So those are the open source highlights for Angaza.
Well, thank you so much for that, and thanks for all the details and the experience. Let me go to Dimitris, and then I do have a few follow-up curiosity questions. Dimitris, floor is yours.
All right, thanks. Very interesting conversation. So I've been involved in the development of 3 open source geospatial solutions that can be used by different stakeholders in the cross-sectoral energy and development space to better identify areas where access to energy should be expanded. The first one focuses on the development of least cost electrification technology and investment outlooks. The name of the tool is ONSET, Open Source Spatial Electrification Tool, modeling outputs of which have been incorporated into World Bank's and ESMAC's global electrification platform. The second application, which is the one that I'm currently leading, the Energy Access Explorer, focuses on the development of high-resolution, on-the-fly geospatial analysis to help different users with different perspectives identify high-priority areas on the fly. No need to download any geospatial software, not to be a programming expert, not to understand where access to energy should be expanded. This particular application, the Energy Access Explorer, functions also as a dynamic information system for admin users. Think, for instance, energy ministries, rural electrification agencies, who can use a dynamic information system in order to manage, administer geospatial data in the energy sector. The third application, we call it Clean Cooking Explorer, is actually a spin-off of the Energy Access Explorer and aims to identify high priority areas where clean cooking solutions should be prioritized. This application is actually being developed in collaboration with UN's Clean Cooking Alliance and a number of other organizations. And the beauty about it is the fact that we do build on an existing infrastructure, and we are able to minimize software engineering costs. All the tools that I mentioned have been developed in close collaboration with a number of colleagues and, of course, partners and local stakeholders in numerous geographies. Why open source? I think most of you may be familiar with the African proverb, if you want to go far, go together. I think, Annette, you also spoke about this point. In other words, right? Because we do operate in a resource-constrained environment and in a time-bound space, we really need to open energy modeling tools to the wider user community. And this is critical to achieving the development agenda by the time that has been set by the international community. We've been hearing by a number of development partners and actors that existing proprietary models are way too expensive for them to adopt in order to drive decisions. And if we think about the sustainability and the scalability of such geospatial solutions, the resource allocation can be rather significant if we multiply subscription costs of proprietary solutions by number of users, number of countries, number of years, and this actually reaches the order of several millions of dollars, or whichever currency you are interested in using. So I do fear that if we don't have open source solutions that can actually be customized with minimal resource requirements, the sector will remain locked in proprietary, resource-intensive, short-term and consultancy type of solutions. That's why I think this is a great start, and I do hope that there will be an increased momentum when it comes to the adoption of open source solutions in our in the space that we're operating. Thanks.
Thank you for this, and it was really nice to hear that in fact the motives behind the sharing, at least for all three of you, actually, all three of your organization, actually was, we just need to share. It's something that we just need to do because others will benefit from this, and I think that is in fact a great reason. Now let me go though into, I'd like to touch a bit on the nitty-gritty, and what I'd like to do is ask you, and I'll start with Bryan and go on then with Annette and Dimitris. You have gone through this journey of sharing open source materials with others. What was the hardest part of it? Why? What were the challenges? And if someone else today of our attendees was to think about, sharing something of what they do, what would you suggest would be the best approach? Just sit down and plan it well because it's very critical and you really want people to do it right, or instead just share whatever you have, they'll figure it out. There are many different approaches to this. What has been yours, and what were the challenges, and what would you have done differently if you could just go back in time? Again, Bryan first, Annette, you go second, and Dimitris, you close. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Fabio. A bunch of stuff to unpack here, but let me focus on at least a couple of the areas you mentioned. What are some of the challenges, and then what maybe initial advice would I give an organization interested in open sourcing some of their work, and how to go about it. So yeah, let me start with the hard stuff. I'll mention two challenges in particular. One I would say is a broad challenge related to really any open source project, which is that it provides value only if it's used. And that means that you need potential users, potential members of what may become a community around a particular project to actually know that it exists, and have some on-ramp to getting involved. I think anyone who has dipped their toes at all into open source, especially open source software, knows that there's no lack of projects out there. It's often a question about how you find the one that's appropriate for you. So maybe skipping a little bit forward to advice, I would say just consider leveraging communities like EnAccess to engage with the broader energy access community and help provide sort of discoverability and on-ramps for your projects. You can build a user base and engage with other organizations invested in the ecosystem. So that's a non-technical hurdle. I would say for the work that Angaza has open sourced in particular, especially the IoT work, we're talking about pieces of software that other organizations may be incorporating into embedded systems. So this means that they are taking code that Angaza put out into the world, and they're writing it into an appliance that's going to go into someone's home, potentially at very large scale. Like I said, some of the work that we've open sourced is deployed in millions of systems. So that raises the quality bar. You really don't want to deploy significant defects at that kind of scale. It's incredibly expensive. It damages the sector. And Angaza has always taken that responsibility very seriously. And one of the challenges then when you go into an open source world is how do you make sure that it's going to be deployed effectively, deployed correctly, and make sure that you're continuing to maintain the appropriate quality bar for embedded software development in an open source context. So we made the decision to invest upfront in tools related to quality, automated systems for doing what's called static analysis, automated testing of the system, as well as better documentation to help potential adopters of the work that we put out there. That said, I think in many cases, the bar is not that high. And so, Fabio, I think you concluded with a question, what would I say to people interested in doing this? And I would say don't set the internal bar too high. I think that organizations often are a little bit scared of putting some of their work out into the world and stop themselves from doing it, which is a shame. So I would say just do it. It can improve over time. You're leveraging the community. And just keep in mind that if it was good enough for what you were doing internally, then it's probably good enough for someone else as well. So I'll wrap up there, and I'd love to hear contributions from everybody else.
Thank you, Bryan. And I just wanna touch on one of your points because it has not really been touched before. On it's the quality aspects, this quality aspect of this, and the reason for touching on that is really that in fact we have supported a number of innovators, a number of companies that were interested in releasing open source materials. And one thing that we have definitely come across over and over is that they were sort of surprised by the fact that knowing that they would release this in the open, automatically the level of quality was a bit higher, because they felt maybe a bit ashamed of, just putting a patch out there. And so the quality of documentation was a bit better, the attention to detail was a bit higher. We have not seen too many getting stuck in this fear of sharing, but to be honest, of course these people were already intending to leverage the open source community, because that was something that we were going to do with them already. And indeed, yes, people can definitely come to us and to advertise their work. That's an important point. So please reach out to EnAccess at our website, enaccess.org, to do so. But Annette, why don't I let you go a couple of minutes, your experience, and what would you have done differently?
Thanks. And I'll start by agreeing with what Bryan just said. The value of the open source is if others use it. And so one of the challenges that we faced and we continue to face in terms of thinking about future open source initiatives is the cost and the time, like resourcing, especially staff time that's needed to be able to curate the content and share it in a way that your audience can consume it, and that it's easy enough for them to understand and easy enough for them to replicate it. Because a lot of times when you're working internally, your team understands everything, but when you're open sourcing something, the audience is very broad. It's people with different understanding, people coming to the project from different perspectives. So it did stick. We didn't just wake up one day and decide, we want to share everything we have done. It took months of like creating the document, having multiple reviews, checking models, checking templates, etc. For it, so that by the time that we are launching, it's a product that is in a form that can be used and improved upon. The other, so that, yeah, I think, and in terms of advice, so that's one of the things that say that to companies that are thinking about open sourcing their projects, I think you have to plan well in advance. Think about all the activities that you'd like to do. What's the final product that you'd like to share out there? How can it be in a way? How can it be in a form that other people can appreciate it and actually improve on it? And then plan for the time, staff time, and the costs. If you need to publish it on websites, if you need to publish reports, you need to think about communication budgets. You need to think about design budgets. If you're publishing it on an open, say on an open source software or website, like or on a server, all those costs, there's a lot of work that goes into it. So that's one of the things that I'd definitely flag. In terms of the other considerations or things that would have stopped us as CBEA to share, I'd say one is the risk of creating competing facilities. So we all know the energy access market is generally still quite young. So a lot of players would, when they develop IP, you want to hold it to yourself so that you can get the edge. So we considered a lot the competition that sharing everything we had spent more than 3 years doing, so that someone else can come and do it in a year or a few months. We considered a lot the competition it posed to our future growth. But at the end of the day, we realized, like I'd mentioned earlier, we'll provide power to 1 million people over the next, say, 3 years. There's still 600 million people without power. So we realized that the potential to accelerate progress towards a common goal in the sector, it outweighed the competition it posed for us. And in a way, we think that the market is big enough for everyone. So despite the fact that this could mean that our competitors go and improve on our approach and maybe do it even faster, we think the shared goal is a much bigger goal. And then the last thing I'd say is there's another risk of misinterpretation in terms of someone would think that, we said this is the only way to finance mini-grids. There's risk that will be misinterpreted as we have solved the mini-grid problem. There was the risk also that we were opening ourselves to criticism and disagreements from the sector and people saying, you did this approach, maybe it doesn't work, and that's a real risk. But in our documentation, one of the things that we kept saying is we believe that this is just one innovation. And we are open sourcing it so that other people can adopt it and improve on it. But it doesn't mean that we haven't stopped the sector from coming up with many other innovations. But as well as, because we shared our lessons, we are expecting that the sector is going to innovate and iterate upon what we've done and not make the mistakes that we have done, and maybe use the recommendations that we have. So I think those are the main things I'd say we considered in terms of open sourcing and the challenges that we faced.
So thank you, Annette. It's quite interesting to see, and I definitely agree with the challenge. This is something also you, Bryan, mentioned. The challenge in the adoption, really. We don't want to open source things for the sake of putting them out there, but we'd like to know that others are actually gonna take on them and hopefully make them better. I'll just mention one thing on this before handing over the floor to Dimitris. But one thing that I'd like to share with you is, in fact, the fact that that's very much what we also have tried to do at EnAccess. In fact, I'd like to show you two things very quickly. One is our website. It's sitting there at enaccess.org. And you'll see something like this. And under this materials section, that's where we try to curate materials so that they can be easier to use for others. We put quite a bit of effort in this, but really we see that as a core part of our work. And so what I would say is, if you are thinking to release something in open source, please do reach out to us. We would like to help. And we would like to help specifically in increasing awareness and increasing the usability of these solutions. One thing we're definitely trying to do is really put some effort into making it easy to start using a certain solution. So maybe making how-to guides or videos or advertisement. And another thing I wanted to mention, because it did come up a couple of times, is that we also created a community around the open source work. And so that's community.enaccess.org. We see that it's taken up momentum, and in fact there is a very, very interesting conversation happening right now, also amongst the guys of Angaza and other companies. I'm gonna mention Simu Solar working on Nexus channel in a Bluetooth implementation, and a few other interesting cases. Now the community is, the name comes, like, they attempt to create a community of like-minded people that actually are passionate about open source and are ready to share and discuss solutions and hopefully improve on them. This is very quick and just addressing these 2 points that were raised a couple of times. We're trying to help with that, so please feel free to reach out if you see a use. Dimitris, back to you. We have another 3 minutes to go, and then I'd like to open the floor to any questions there may be, and then we'll need to wrap up. Dimitris, floor yours.
All right, thanks. Let me go back briefly to a couple of challenges that we have faced, and I believe all of you addressed some of these earlier. So I think one issue that we've been seeing is that the term open source is usually interchangeably used with the term open access. The software can be, as you pointed out, Fabio, open source. Data can be either open or confidential or proprietary, right? So messaging open source properly is key. The second point, making sure attributions are given to the original developers and to the contributors is important. Not everyone in the open source space does so, and this can create confusion. So the second point. The third, maintaining an active community is rather critical, especially if we want to keep on advancing and building on an existing open source infrastructure. Whether I would do open source again, definitely without saying, being as mission oriented as I am, I would do open source again and again and again. The joy I get when I see people who otherwise wouldn't have access to these solutions and can improve the way decision making is carried out, to me, is invaluable. The advice I would give to others that may be interested in exploring or adopting open source solutions. Make sure that your source code, and again, I think Fabio touched on this point, make sure that your source code is well documented, easy to follow, so others can build on it with minimal resources. And a couple of things that need to be improved. Messaging the importance of open source solutions in the energy access space is something that needs to be improved. I think this is a wonderful start. I do hope that there will be more relevant conversations in the future. We also need to keep track of relevant solutions. You pointed out to this database. We at WRI, together with partners, are keen to contribute with relevant open source geospatial solutions in the energy access space. So let me pause here. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, and I'm really glad that we could cover all these different aspects. I'd like to take a few minutes now to start looking into questions that are appearing, and I'll first, maybe Dimitris is a practical one. People are asking, where can we find out more about the project that you had talked about? Where are they? Where can people go and find them?
All right. So I mentioned briefly 3 projects: the Energy Access Explorer, which you can find at energyAccessExplorer.org, prototype for 3 countries in the East African region: Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania. And we will be launching in additional countries in October: Ethiopia, Zambia, and several more to come. ONSET, which is the open source special electrification tool, which is currently being led by KTH, the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm, Sweden, at onset.org, and a recent application, which is the global electrification platform developed by or led by World Bank and ESMA, and multiple contributing partners, one of which WRI. And finally, the Clean Cooking Explorer, which is a spin-off of the Energy Access Explorer, will be launched towards the end of this year, prototype for Nepal. The idea is to expand to include additional geographies in the near future. It will be found at cleancookingexplorer.org.
Well, thank you for this, and we'll also actually drop this information. As I said, we will be publishing a recording of this webinar, and we will be publishing these links as additional text to that. And also we will publish these references in the community so people can see it in multiple places. There is another interesting question. I think this applies a bit more to, I suspect, Bryan, but maybe not. Bryan, I'll let you judge. How can this be applied to a hardware solution? How do you make a viable business model using open source specifically for hardware? Bryan, I don't know if you want to take it from your experience or things you've seen around you.
Yeah, that's a great question with 2 parts. Obviously, the work that Angaza has done related to our Nexus projects is an example of open source applied to embedded software. I do think that there's applicability to open source applied to literal hardware designs. I think you can apply many of the same techniques, the same licenses, the same tools to hardware elements. I think that's something that Angaza may do in the future. We do provide some hardware solutions and have built some hardware solutions aimed at enabling manufacturers. And so that really fits in our core mission if we were to open source some of that work. Speaking off the cuff though, no promises. I think you do see really exciting open source hardware work in other communities outside of energy access. So there are real templates to draw on. In terms of business models, hardware is certainly an interesting one because like software in some cases, you have the code or the schematics or the other sort of hardware related materials that you can open source, but an entire company obviously involves much more than that. And so when you see companies built around open source software in other areas, you see them open sourcing sometimes even fairly central bits of their technology, but then the overall service that they provide is what they charge money for. And I think that is something that can kind of get glossed over a little bit when you're thinking about open source and technology. You're not just sort of looking at value from the code. Obviously, the code is important, but really when someone wants to adopt that piece of code, what they really need are experts in that code. They need an organization that's built around deploying, supporting that code for you as a customer. So I don't want the takeaway from this webinar to be necessarily open source and open source tools can solve all of your problems for free. I think there are good reasons why companies pay money to get all of the services that surround a particular bit of open source technology, while still having that sharing be something that moves the entire industry or an area of the technology sector forward. So those are my thoughts.
Yeah, and I'll add a bit on this coming from the EnAccess experience with a number of different companies. We see some companies actually focus on the on open sourcing the hardware, knowing that in fact people, as Bryan said, people will actually want their support when they're going for the real market. So there is definitely a services component to it. But additionally to that, there is another bit that I find very fascinating. A lot of the hardware solutions that we see actually do hand in hand with a software solution, very often a cloud-based software solution. And you often have the opportunity, and you could say, well, I want to build the hardware myself, but I will use the existing maybe closed source cloud solution, or even open source but hosted cloud solutions. This is something that we find very interesting. On this note, as EnAccess, we are, I mentioned earlier, we are actually working with Simu Solar, and they are implementing a Bluetooth implementation of Nexus channel by Angaza. Now, all this is open source, but we did hit a bit of a snag when it came to how is the data going to be processed. So what we did was we actually started a free, this time in terms of free as in beer, free as in cost, implementation of thingsboard.io. So this is something that people can run on our service without spending a dime. And the idea is really to try to take away barriers, because sometimes a hardware implementation actually needs to have something more to it. Now, I don't see any more questions coming, and so I'm going to hand it over just in a second back to Gabriele for the closing remarks. But I wanted to just say very quickly that we're going to have a second webinar on this topic on the 28th of September at the same time. And so we will send an invite to the participants of today's webinar to actually attend that one. That one is going to be a follow-on on this webinar, going a bit more in detail on some aspects. The last thing I want to say is, yeah, just generally a thank you to the participants, and thank you to the panelists. It was really interesting having you on board today. And I do encourage people to go and register on community.enaccess.org, and I hope the panelists can also be there and chime in whenever a question comes on for their projects. Gabriele, back to you, and thanks so much for participating today.
Yes, thank you very much, Fabio. And really, I have to say it was a very interesting, very inspiring conversation, discussion. I also learned a lot about open sourcing, I have to admit. So it's also quite new concept for me. So it's interesting to see really the real world examples and experiences, the challenges you were facing. I was specifically intrigued by, I think all of you highlighted it, the main motivation of open sourcing is really to share with the community and to have this common objective to achieve universal energy access, because there's this big challenge still ahead of us. And with open sourcing technologies, business models, financial structures, and so on. We are coming closer also to unlock more resources into the sector that will help to to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So I would also like to thank you very much. It was, as I said, very interesting, these kind of first impressions. As Fabio already mentioned, there will be this second part of this webinar series in 2 weeks' time, on the 28th of September. At the same time, it's, I think, 9 a.m. New York time and 3 p.m. Paris time. So that webinar will focus more on the perspective of adopters of open source innovations. So that will be also quite interesting to hear about their experience, the challenges that they faced, and the benefits they actually had with this. So I would also like to thank you very much for the attendance today, invite you and encourage you all to participate in the next webinar in 2 weeks' time, to basically see the whole picture of the open source community. So with this, I would like to close. Thank you very much. Also, thank you very much for EnAccess Foundation. It was really a pleasure for us to support this series, as it is really for the benefit of the sector. Thank you very much. Have a good rest of the day, good evening, and see you soon in 2 weeks' time.
Thank you to all.